Russia is now lecturing the United States of America about the rules-based international order. And the worst part is that they have a point. When the UN Security Council convened an emergency meeting to address America's military action in Venezuela, something happened that should alarm every single American regardless of where they fall on the political spectrum. Not one allied nation stood up to defend the United States. Not Britain, not France, not Germany, not Japan, not a single country that has historically stood alongside America in international forums said a word in support. And if you think that kind of total diplomatic isolation happens by accident, you haven't been paying attention to what just unfolded on the world stage. The Emergency Security Council meeting was called after United States forces moved against Venezuela's government, and the international response was immediate and overwhelmingly negative, in ways that the administration clearly did not anticipate when they launched this operation. China's deputy ambassador stood before the council and said that China is deeply shocked by and strongly condemns the unilateral, illegal, and bullying acts of the United States.
On January the 3rd, the United States blatantly launched large-scale military strikes against Venezuela, forcibly seized Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro and his wife, and took them out of the country. It claimed that it will run Venezuela and even didn't rule out launching a second round of military operations on an even larger scale. China is deeply shocked by and strongly condemns the unilateral, illegal, and bullying acts of the U.S. For some time now, the international community has repeatedly expressed grave concern over the U.S. sanctions, blockade, and threats of force against Venezuela. The Council convened 2 emergency meetings, during which Secretary General Guterres, many Council members, and countries in the region and beyond unanimously called for abiding by the UN Charter and the international law, maintaining calm and restraint, resolving disputes peacefully, de-escalating tensions, and safeguarding regional stability. However, as a permanent member of the Council, the U.S. has disregarded the grave concerns of the international community, wantonly trampled upon Venezuela's sovereignty, security, and legitimate rights and interests, and seriously violated the principles of sovereign equality, non-interference in internal affairs, peaceful settlement of international disputes, and the prohibition of the use of force in international relations. These principles constitute the fundamental tenets of the UN Charter and form the cornerstone of maintaining international peace and security in Latin America and the Caribbean, and indeed internationally. China firmly opposes this, and the international community has also expressed widespread grave concern and strong condemnation. We urge the U.S. to heed the overwhelming voice of the international community, abide by international law and the purposes and principles of the UN Charter, cease infringing upon the sovereignty and security of other countries, stop toppling the government of Venezuela, and return to the path of political solutions through dialogue and negotiations. We call on the U.S. to ensure the personal safety of President Maduro and his wife and to release them at once. We support the Council in fulfilling its primary responsibility to maintain international peace and security, and we support all efforts by the UN Secretary General, regional countries, and organizations that contribute to promoting dialogue and de-escalating the situation. President, the lessons of history are a stark warning. Military means are not the solution to problems, and the indiscriminate use of force will only lead to greater crisis.
Those words carry weight because China doesn't usually speak that directly about American actions in public forums. But here's where things get truly uncomfortable for anyone who remembers America's rhetoric over the past few decades about international law and sovereignty. Russia's ambassador stood up and said, and I want you to really hear this, here is your rules-based world order in all of its glory, which is horrifying. He went on to say that Russia is particularly appalled by the unparalleled cynicism which Washington did not even attempt to conceal. When Russia gets to lecture America about following international rules, something has gone catastrophically wrong with American foreign policy.
Depending upon the political landscape. Today, we are reaping the consequences of their recklessness and selectivity in matters related to respect for the norms of international law, which were linked to the so-called rules-based world order. Here is your rules-based world order. Due to a fear of angering the American global gendarme, which is attempting to once again rear its head. We are particularly appalled by the unparalleled cynicism with which Washington did not even attempt to conceal the true aims of its criminal operation, namely the establishment of unbridled control over Venezuela's natural resources and the assertion of their hegemonical ambitions in Latin America.
The Trump administration's response to international condemnation has been to insist that this wasn't actually a war or an invasion, but rather what they're calling a law enforcement operation. And I need you to understand what that rhetorical move is designed to accomplish. Michael Waltz went on camera and said there is no war against Venezuela or its people, and that we are not occupying a country.
As Secretary Rubio stated just yesterday, this is the Western Hemisphere. This is where we live, and we're not going to allow the Western Hemisphere to be used as a base of operation for our nation's adversaries and competitors and rivals of the United States. You can't turn Venezuela into the operating hub for Iran, for Hezbollah, for gangs, for Cuban intelligence agents, and other malign actors that control that country. You cannot continue to have the largest energy reserves in the world under the control of adversaries of the United States, under the control of illegitimate leaders, and not benefiting the people of Venezuela, and stolen by a handful of oligarchs inside of Venezuela. Colleagues, the United States successfully carried out a surgical law enforcement operation facilitated by the U.S. military against two indicted fugitives of American justice, narco-terrorist Nicolas Maduro and Celia Flores. Colleagues, Nicolas Maduro is responsible for attacks on the people of the United States, for destabilizing the Western Hemisphere, and illegitimately repressing the people of Venezuela. As Secretary Rubio has said, there is no war against Venezuela or its people. We are not occupying a country. This was a law enforcement operation in furtherance of lawful indictments that have existed for decades. The United States arrested a narco trafficker who is now going to stand trial in the United States in accordance with the rule of law for the crimes he's committed against our people for 15 years. A similar action was taken in 1989 against Manuel Noriega.
But calling an invasion law enforcement doesn't change what happened. It just changes how they want you to think about what happened. This is the same playbook that authoritarian governments use when they want to make aggressive military action sound acceptable to domestic audiences. The fact that American officials are now using identical linguistic tricks should concern anyone who values honest government communication. State media outlets immediately picked up the law enforcement operation framing and repeated it without question, which is exactly how propaganda functions, regardless of whether the country doing it calls itself a democracy or not. Michael Waltz said something during this crisis that deserves far more attention than it received, because he essentially stated American imperial ambitions out loud without any apparent concern for how it would sound to the rest of the world. He said, and this is a direct quote, "This is the Western Hemisphere. This is where we live." Then he followed that up by saying, "You cannot continue to have the largest energy reserves in the world under the control of adversaries. Venezuela has the largest energy reserves in the world, and American officials are openly stating that controlling those resources is the motivation behind military action. This makes it essentially impossible to claim this was about democracy or human rights, or any of the other justifications that usually accompany American interventions." Russia's ambassador pointed this out at the Security Council, noting that Washington did not even attempt to conceal its true intentions. When your adversaries can accurately describe your motivations using your own officials' words, you've lost the narrative battle completely. 6 Latin American countries issued a joint statement condemning American actions, and I want you to understand why that matters so much for the future of American influence in the region. Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Spain, Mexico, and Uruguay all signed onto a statement opposing what the United States did. These aren't hostile nations or traditional American adversaries. These are countries that have generally maintained cooperative relationships with Washington for decades. Denmark's ambassador reminded the Security Council that the principles of sovereignty, political independence, and territorial integrity must be respected, and then added that the inviolability of borders is not up for negotiation. That might sound like standard diplomatic language until you remember that Trump has also been threatening Greenland, which belongs to Denmark. Spain's Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez said that respect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all states is a non-negotiable principle. The UK's Prime Minister Keir Starmer specifically stated that the future of Greenland is for Greenland and the Kingdom of Denmark. While the United Nations Security Council was debating whether American military action violated the foundational principles of international law, President Trump was on social media posting conspiracy theories about the 2020 election. I genuinely don't know how to explain that level of disconnection between the gravity of the international situation and the apparent priorities of the person who ordered the military action in the first place. Meanwhile, Republican members of Congress were going on television to defend the invasion using language that would be funny if the consequences weren't so serious. Tom Emmer called Trump the president of peace while defending a military invasion.
It's a great day, quite frankly, Maria. You talk about the extraction of Maduro. Actually, it was the extradition of a illegitimate leader, someone who stole an election, was not the legitimate president of Venezuela. And it's amazing that the Trump administration has the courage because of their leader. Donald Trump is the president of peace, and what he's doing is stabilizing the region. Americans are safer today. The region is safer today, the Western Hemisphere, because of the action that the Trump administration took the other night.
Rick Scott claimed that Trump is committed to freedom and democracy in Venezuela while the administration was installing Delcy Rodriguez, a figure from the Maduro regime, as a puppet leader, specifically to gain access to Venezuelan oil. The Venezuelan opposition leaders who actually won the 2024 election were rejected by Trump because they wouldn't give him what he wanted. Some MAGA Republicans have tried to justify the Venezuela action by comparing it to Teddy Roosevelt's Monroe Doctrine, as if reaching back to early 20th century imperialism somehow makes modern imperialism acceptable. This tells you everything you need to know about how they view American power and its legitimate uses. The administration has also drawn comparisons to the 1989 operation in Panama that captured Manuel Noriega, apparently not realizing that citing previous examples of American intervention doesn't actually address whether this intervention was legal or wise. Japan's prime minister noted that challenges to international order are picking up speed across the Indo-Pacific, which is diplomatic language for saying that when America violates international law, it gives permission to everyone else to do the same thing. Every time a democracy acts like an authoritarian state, actual authoritarians get to point and say that democracies are no different. Russia and China now have decades' worth of rhetorical ammunition to use every time America tries to criticize their behavior. The UN Secretary General's statement, read by Undersecretary Rosemary DiCarlo, emphasized that the power of law must prevail and called for respect for the UN Charter and all applicable legal frameworks to safeguard peace and security. But these words only matter if powerful countries actually follow them. Article 2, Paragraph 4 of the UN Charter explicitly prohibits using or threatening force against the territorial integrity of member states. And that principle exists precisely because powerful countries have historically used military force to take what they want from weaker nations. When America violates these principles, it weakens the entire system that American diplomats helped build after World War II, specifically to prevent powerful nations from simply taking territory and resources through military force. The international condemnation at the Security Council wasn't just about Venezuela. It was about whether the rules that America insisted everyone else follow for 70 years still apply when America decides they're inconvenient. The most important thing to understand about what happened at the United Nations is not that other countries criticized America, because that happens regularly and usually doesn't mean much in terms of actual consequences. What matters is the complete absence of support from nations that have historically backed American positions, combined with the fact that America's adversaries can now use American actions as justification for whatever they want to do in their own regions of influence. Russia invaded Ukraine and faced global condemnation, and American officials led the charge in calling that invasion a violation of international law and the rules-based order. China threatens Taiwan, and American officials warn about the dangers of changing borders through force, but now, when America does the same thing, those same officials expect the world to accept a different standard, and the world is clearly not willing to do that anymore. Break international law and you lose the moral authority to criticize anyone else for doing the same thing, and that loss of moral authority has consequences that will extend far beyond Venezuela for years to come.